I first met Senator Malcolm Roberts from Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party Queensland a few years ago at a Family First conference where I was emceeing a Q&A panel which included Malcolm after he'd earlier given an address on climate change. He's one of the few people I've met who can recall facts and data to authoritatively rebut fake news and corrupted data when climate alarmists appeal to authority to validate their own arguments or ridicule their opponents. Malcolm's background is in engineering, with keen interests in not only the climate but also economics and business. His passion for speaking truth to power is what brought him to our attention back then, and it's his frustration with the culture of appeasement in the political classes that prompted him to enter the political arena himself in the 2016 federal election, where he joined Senator Pauline Hanson in challenging the sacred cows of climate religion and their chanting high priests in the media. Welcome, Senator.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. One correction.
Yes?
I enjoyed your introduction, not only on climate, but also the personal introduction. That is, I'm not a senator for One Nation. I'm a senator for Queensland, and I'm with One Nation.
Very good. Actually, our guest last week, George Christensen, was also similarly motivated to be representing his electorate first and party second. I agree. I like that order of priorities.
Well, we're servants to the people of Queensland and Australia, so and that's the way we need to remember it.
Yeah, well said. So tell me, how did you first get interested in the climate debate? You've got an engineering background. Yeah,
it's a mining engineering degree, and as part of that we have to keep people alive underground, so that means ventilating. So we have to understand atmospheric gases, including carbon dioxide. So when I first started hearing comments about carbon dioxide going to be destroying the planet, I thought this is ridiculous, because carbon dioxide doesn't warm anything. It's a very low reactive gas, and so it's naturally occurring. So it's colourless, odourless, tasteless, non-toxic, essential for all life on the planet, and we can't control the level in the atmosphere, which I'll show you later. So how can it be a pollutant? It's not a pollutant, it's essential for all life on Earth. But I thought, they're saying that this gas will somehow catastrophically warm the planet, and it's just ridiculous. But you know, the same thing happens. Who's little old me to doubt thousands of scientists and hundreds of politicians? They must know it automatically.
So we're told.
Kowtowing to authority. That's the way we've been trained in our education system. But it just burned within. I thought, this is nonsense, and it just wouldn't let go. So I then started investigating, and I found the science. There's no science there supporting the claim, none at all. In fact, the actual empirical evidence, which is what decides science, the beauty of science is that it's not driven by the person with the biggest bank, the biggest bicep, or the biggest club, or the biggest gun, or the biggest wallet. It's driven by empirical evidence. So that's what makes it beautiful. It's objective, Dave. So what the empirical evidence shows is the complete reverse of what we're being told. So then in the course of investigating the science, I found out about the corruption. And in the course then, after investigating the science, I delved into the corruption. In the course of investigating the corruption, I found what was driving it. And that's what we really need to be scared of.
What's driving it?
Big money. And Maurice Strong is he died in 2015. He was the first, in fact he was the founder. He's quite an interesting character. He was an interesting character. Where do you start with Maurice Strong? He was a Canadian billionaire who was into oil exploration and marketing. So he was on using hydrocarbon fuels. And he became very wealthy, and he decided at a very young age, I think he was only in his mid-20s, that he was after power. And I mean, this is all documented. So he went and he parked his oil company. I think he let someone else run it. And he became familiar or connected with Canada's largest or most powerful family. And that family has connections in both sides of politics. And it is very, very influential. And he got involved in that family because it gave an introduction into politics. And someone reportedly once asked him, why don't you go into politics? And he said, no, the power is not in the politics, the power is in the people behind the politics. And it's telling that prior to that, at the age of about 17, he did an internship or spent some time at the UN, just in its early days in 47, I think it was, 1947. And remember, he's only young at that time. And when he went back home, someone asked him a question. What was your experience like in the UN? Now, what 17-year-old Dave answers like this? That place is going to be phenomenally powerful one day. He was already switched onto the power of the UN. And so in 1970, he commissioned a study into the state of the Earth. And then, based upon that result, and there were genuine pollution concerns, water pollution, air pollution, he then drove in the UN the desire for having the United Nations Environmental Programme. And in 1972, Maurice Strong saw the United Nations Environmental Programme come into being. And later in 72, he became the first Secretary General of the United Nations Environmental Programme. Now, if you go back to the 1970s, environment was very, very important. It was already starting to be used emotionally for politics. He turned it to an art form. He understood the power of the emotion and the way you could just glaze people's eyes and just capture their hearts, because people inherently care. So what he did was he drove that into a very, very powerful political weapon. And in 1992, and remember that the Secretary General of the United Nations, who's his boss, doesn't know much about the environment. Knows a little bit about diplomacy and politics, not much about the environment. So whatever Maurice Strong said went. And then when we understand that Maurice Strong was very, very capable at networking and at manipulating people and well into power, then we start to understand what this man did, what he's capable of doing. And what he did in 1992 was he led the 1992 Rio de Janeiro Declaration for 21st Century Global Governance, now known as Agenda 21. 21st Century Global Governance. Now, in that, he pulled all the people together and co-opted non-government organisations and created a groundswell which couldn't be missed by the politicians. And that groundswell then is what he used to drive the climate change bandwagon. What he also did, very cleverly, was he manipulated governments and departments and cleverly orchestrated things so that the money would align with his interests. Now, this capped off 20 years of his work. So let's step back to 1972. He was now first Secretary General of the United Nations Environmental Programme, and he came up with the idea of global warming. Now, in 1974, we'd had 40 years of cooling. And then in 1976, and there were claims that we'd be having catastrophic global cooling due to carbon from coal and oil. The theory was that this cooling was unusual. It wasn't, but that was the theory. And that the soot or the particulates from burning coal and oil would blanket out the sun and cause us to be freezing. So just remember that hydrocarbon fuels were the cause of the blame, supposedly. 1976, we had a sudden jump in temperature, entirely natural, and then slight increase in temperature through to 1980. In 1980, he convened the world's first climate conference. I believe it was in Villach, Austria, little town Villach, Austria, in 1980, and the United Nations invited governments to send their hand-picked representatives. So they sent these scientists, and they were talking about global warming, just 4 years after they were talking about global cooling. And what the UN did was they shoved a charter in front of them and said, sign this. And it was a declaration saying that we are being warmed unusually, and that it's due to use of hydrocarbon fuels, coal and oil and gas. And the scientists said, there's no evidence. We're not signing that. So they learnt their lesson. And in 1985, the UN convened another conference in Villach, Austria. But instead of inviting the governments to send their scientific representatives, what they did was what any clever bureaucrat does, Maurice Strong being the cleverest. They selected the scientists and said to the governments of each country, send this particular person. So they had their hand-picked scientists.
Why did the governments cooperate?
Because the United Nations. And that's fundamental to all of this, Dave, because the United Nations is a very undemocratic organisation, very totalitarian organisation with no accountability. It's driven by just a handful of people, and we don't even get a say in who they are. So in 1985, the UN said, sign this declaration. The scientists all signed it, and that was the start. A man called Pauline, he became the first chairman of the IPCC in 1988. But in 1985, he wrote the report from the 1985 conference that the UN orchestrated. And he said global warming due to hydrocarbon fuels, and we need to investigate it. Now, in early 1988, in March, he co-authored a newspaper article saying that we need a carbon dioxide tax. But in 1988, later in 1988, he was appointed the first chairman of the IPCC, which Maurice Strong orchestrated. So Maurice Strong got a number of the meteorological bureaus from around the world, the Bureau of Meteorology, the Met Office, NOAA, those kinds of organizations. And he combined that with his own little organization, the United Nations Environmental Program. Yep. And so he orchestrated their combination to co-sponsor the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which he orchestrated to be underneath the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So remember that, because the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change openly states that it is about creating a new world order economically and socially and governance-wise. Maurice Strong himself has been quoted as saying that he had two main objectives. The first is unelected socialist global governance. He's out there. He was a socialist. The second aim that he had, and you'll really love this one, is to deindustrialize Western civilization.
Take us back to 1860s.
The cave days, that's right, 1860s.
Wow.
So remembering then that what has freed up billions of people, literally, Dave, as you point out in your introduction, is the use of cheap fuel. And the Industrial Revolution has liberated people from being dependent upon nature in terms of the vagaries of climate and the warming periods and the cooling periods, the droughts, the famines, the floods. We have been inoculated against that through our technology. Yeah. It's also increased lifespan. It's increased availability of people to move freely between jobs, which has given us more freedom, given us much more science, protected the environment.
This morning that the level of industrialization of a nation dramatically increases the survivability of natural catastrophes.
Well, not only that, it's the biggest thing for protecting our environment, because humans really care. So what happens is that when energy becomes cheaper, it becomes more productive. When we become more productive, we become more prosperous. When we become more prosperous, many things happen. First of all, women start getting educated. Yep. And that is a significant thing. And that dramatically decreases the birth rate. So the actual human footprint is reduced thanks to the use of cheap energy, driving productivity. Fundamental. And that's not disputed by anyone. The second thing that happens is, as we become more wealthy, we want more leisure. And when we go to the beach for the holidays, if there's oil on the beach, we're not happy.
We're not enjoying that.
So then we decide we need to spend on caring for the environment. And because of our wealth, we can afford to do that. So for example, in 1826, I think it was, Sydney celebrated the opening of Australia's first street lamp circuit at night. And they were powered by whale oil. Now, we don't need to harvest whales for whale oil. And so the whales are thriving again.
Wow.
And that's due to coal and oil. Yep. The other thing that we used to do was we used to burn a lot of timber for heating, for cooking, for warmth. We don't do that anymore. And the area covered by forests in the developed continents is now 30% higher than it was 100 years ago, thanks to coal and oil. So forests and whales can thank coal and oil. So what happens when we reduce the price of energy through high-density hydrocarbon fuels, it is. We then free up people, free up their careers, give them longer lifespans, give them healthier lifespans, give them much more ease, much more comfort. We get slaves doing our work in the form of mechanical devices, washing machines, fridges, healthier lifestyles, and better protection from nature's vagaries. So it's a win for everyone. And so what we're doing now, as a result of the climate scam that Maurice Strong put in place, we are now reversing that decreasing in energy price, and we're artificially increasing energy price, sending us backwards. But Maurice Strong's real cleverness was not in concocting this and manipulating the various agencies around the world. I mean, that takes exceptional ability. But what he did was align the interests of people. And so he aligned the academics at universities by the control of grants through federal parliaments around the world, dictated by a groundswell by co-opting the various groups like Greenpeace, World Wildlife Fund, etc., and by creating a groundswell and a political opinion, then he drove that. And so we now have governments who have no idea what they're doing, actively basically shutting off scientific funding to so many entities, so many topics, and giving it all to climate. So these days, if you're a scientist and you want funding for your horny-toed green frog or whatever it is, then you'll have to talk about the climate impacts of the horny-toed green frog. Or if you want to study the barrier reef, study the climate aspects of barrier reef. And so what in essence that does, Dave, is it endorses this claim, and at the same time it drives the outcome of that study. So we will have somewhere in the outcome saying climate change needs to be researched more because its effect on the frogs, even though there's no climate change going on. There's no unusual climate change. So he aligned the bankers, because he got carbon dioxide trading in place. He also, for example, is a direct...
Doesn't it sound ridiculous, carbon dioxide trading?
It does, mate, but people can't believe that this much could be so orchestrated, but it is. We've got it all documented, and Murray Strong's been open about this. He was on the board of the Chicago Climate Exchange, which governed the trading of carbon dioxide credits. Al Gore's company, Generation Investment Management, was the major shareholder on the Chicago Climate Exchange. And there he sat alongside Maurice Strong. I mean, that's how close it is. And then Barack Obama, the president of the United States, former president of the United States, was sitting on the Joyce Foundation as a director. He was a nobody, sitting on the Joyce Foundation. They gave Goldman Sachs $10 million to join the Chicago Climate Exchange. So we got one of the world's wealthiest banks being given money to join this. So now all of a sudden you've got top bureaucrats in the world, in the UN, you've got top businessmen, you've got top politicians, and you've got top banks all aligned, all making a lot of money. And then you get Al Gore making a very glossy, emotional movie funded by Paramount.
The power of media.
Inconvenient Truth. And he came down here at Kevin Rudd's invitation early in April 2007 and ignited the climate debate and climate discussion in this country. And then you had him getting a lead in the polls as a result of Al Gore and the climate fraud that was being perpetrated. And so John Howard, who is clearly not a supporter of this, he actively then came out and led the way on policy as a way of trying to counteract Kevin Rudd. And in 4 years after John Howard retired from politics, he actually came out and said that he was agnostic on climate. So, John Howard, why did you introduce the first renewable energy target, which is now decimating industry? Why did you introduce the first emissions trading scheme, which was then gave Kevin Rudd the leg up to doing that? Why did you then steal farmers' property rights to comply with Kyoto Protocol, even though you said you would never sign it? So the person who has done the most damage on this is Liberal Prime Minister John Howard, because he lacked the courage to follow his conviction and expose the climate scam because Kevin Rudd was doing so well in the polls.
When everybody's describing how beautiful the Emperor's clothes are, it can be very scary, especially for your career prospects as a politician, to come out and say, I think the Emperor's naked.
Exactly. And then, of course, Malcolm Turnbull carried the can afterwards. Kevin Rudd's in power. Malcolm Turnbull then almost signed the emissions trading scheme into place. Kevin Rudd fell over at the last minute, and Tony Abbott called him on it. Barnaby Joyce, there's Barnaby Joyce, the strongest skeptic, most outspoken skeptic there is in Australian politics at that time. Now we see him facing Tony Windsor and a threat of not getting elected in the seat of New England, and Malcolm Turnbull tosses him $400 million of taxpayer funds to build wind farms, and all of a sudden Barnaby Joyce goes silent on climate. When he knows it's rubbish. So what people don't see is how this can be so well orchestrated by one man, and it's none of the major players are really part of any big drive for doing this. They just fall into place because of Maurice Strong's ability to orchestrate systems and make sure the money went to the right places.
So boil this down for me. Exactly. There's a lot of information, a lot of data, and a lot of moving pieces there. So for the average punter out there, the hairdresser, the plumber, exactly how does Murray Strong or his cohort directly benefit? What enjoyment do they derive from the power that they've accumulated through the unelected representation of the United Nations rallying behind the chorus line of climate alarmism?
Well, I'm guessing you're not into control. Because you're a Christian, so you're not into control. Jesus taught the world about grace and about forgiveness and about love. That's the very opposite of control. Jesus, as I understand it, taught, and I've read the Bible several times, but I'm not a practicing Christian.
Sure.
But I aspire to Jesus' teachings, just like I aspire to some of Buddha's teachings as well. Whereas Buddha talked about equanimity and basically equanimity and finding liberation through self, exploration, Christ taught about the same way, but he talked specifically about forgiveness and love. And Christ taught us about fear and guilt, and the way out of fear and guilt being through love and compassion and forgiveness. And Buddha taught us the same. They're both talking about getting away from fear and control. Anybody who wants to control another person is essentially full of fear himself or herself.
Sure.
Always beneath control there's fear. So I can't tell you what really drives that. I've done a lot of personal exploration over recent years, but I do understand that those who do try to control have, in essence, some fear driving them.
What I mean is tangibly, not spiritually, what do they derive from it, but like, how does that end up as money in their bank or advantage for their friends and family? Like, how does me paying money to the Australian government for climate change end up in their bank account? Well,
underneath, and I was heading to the same place because that's where I was trying to get to. When someone tries to control, there's always fear within them. Now, every single thing that everyone does is done to meet a need. So some of these people think they're doing what's best for the planet. They don't understand the facts. They don't understand that Thomas Malthus was completely wrong. They don't understand that humans have one mouth and one belly and two eyes and one heart. So they think that humans are greedy, irresponsible, uncaring because their own view of themselves is along similar lines. You know what I'm getting at. So they think humans are rapacious, they're greedy, irresponsible, uncaring.
Plague on the planet.
Exactly. And what did, was it Charles or Prince Charles or his father say he wants to come back as a virus so he can kill humanity? Remember that statement?
No, I don't.
Ridiculous comments,
yes.
But there is a sense that humans need to be controlled. Humans are evil, whereas I have a sense that humans are very caring and loving. Sure, we have our aberrations, we have our Adolf Hitlers, but humans are essentially decent people. And so we have this mindset that is driven by control that says humans are evil or humans need to be controlled, very fear-filled, very guilt-ridden. And those people do things partly altruism, largely ignorance, but then of course some people like the money that's involved. So they create a scam around that carbon dioxide trading based on nothing. Trading carbon dioxide, colourless, odourless, tasteless gas, whose trace quantities in the atmosphere. So we have then other people wanting to do it for a variety of other reasons. People jumping on the bandwagon like Kevin Rudd. I mean, his own cabinet told us what they thought of him. A control freak, micromanager.
Sure.
Obviously control-driven. And Kevin Rudd was described as a narcissist by his own people. So how does a person like that capture a whole party, a Labor Party, and then capture a whole country and inflict us with so many disastrous policies?
Exactly.
So there's the answer to your question. It can be done at a local council level. It can be done at a state level. Peter Beattie comes to mind, a control freak. Very, in my opinion, not worthy of my trust whatsoever. Controlled a lot and did a lot of damage in this state. Drove us into bankruptcy, Peter Beattie, but a wonderful smile and beguiling. And then you have Kevin Rudd, who didn't have Peter Beattie's charm and personality, but had access to a bank book, which said basically he could spend billions of dollars literally grabbing headlines, a control freak. So then you take that to an international level where there's no accountability, and you can see people behind the scenes manipulating. So you've got Maurice Strong, personal glory. You've got Maurice Strong, the criminal, wanted for investigation by the United States police, died in exile in China because he was wanted for criminal activities to do with the UN Oil for Food program, criminal activities possibly in Colorado and other states in the United States. Yet he became the man who drove this whole scam just by creating a groundswell, manipulating public opinion. Very easy to do. So there are lots of different vested interests in there. And then, of course, you get those involved. You start saying, well, we need renewable energy, even though it's intermittent and it defies logic. Then you make sure that you get people with vested interests driving that. So we now have renewable energy people, or intermittents as I call them, solar energy people making money out of subsidies. We have people making money out of wind farms, even though wind farms can't pay for themselves. And so all aligned by their financial interest. Very, very simple at heart. So mums and dads, hairdressers, butchers, bakers, the plumber. How does this happen? It's hard for us to see because we're not motivated that way. But when we understand how these people motivate and then make money off the side, or some of them make control off the side and power, then it's very easy to understand. Just look at Kevin Rudd and Peter Beattie.